This video is for the AQA AS Macroeconomic course, so it's looking at paper 2. And what we're going to be looking at is the diagrams that are needed for different situations and different macroeconomic scenarios and what might come up in your exam. So the first thing I want to do is just give you some generic advice about drawing diagrams, because every time I have a class, there'll be at least one student who draws a diagram which doesn't really fit the bill. And what I mean by fitting the bill is it's to do with, is it big enough, first of all? Can we actually see what you're trying to prove clearly within the diagram? I personally believe that your diagram should be probably a third of the page at least, okay, minimum a third of the page, maybe even half a page, to really show the examiner what you're trying to get across and the point that you're trying to make. Is it actually incorporated into your analysis? Now, I many times I see a floating diagram, just a random diagram on the page, which I have no idea what it refers to. And in your analysis, you have to directly relate it to the point that you're making. You should be saying, as you can see in the diagram, and then referring back to the points that you've made, referring back to what's happening to aggregate demand, what's happening to maybe long run or short run aggregate supply, and make it clear and refer back to the analytical point that you've made before. Is it labelled? I mean, this is down to just sheer laziness, I'm afraid, but it happens. And you have to make sure that everything you put in your diagram is labelled. If it's a shift, you have to refer what has happened to national income or output, what has happened to the price level. You have to label absolutely everything that you've put in your diagram. And does it link back to the question? And this is probably the hardest element. Is the diagram that you're using, is it actually appropriate for the point that you're making? I've seen now and again students use diagrams which I wouldn't personally use, and I don't think it really relates to the point that you're trying to make, and that's the reason why I've created this diagram, to help you with that. So the first scenario we're going to look at is, what diagrams could you draw when considering demand pull inflation? And I've picked two specific diagrams which I think would help you, depending on the point that you're trying to make, but it would also give you good analysis in terms of looking at the difference between the diagrams. So the first diagram I'm going to look at in terms of demand pull inflation relates to the classical approach. And this is the classical viewpoint of long-run aggregate supply, because the classical economists believe that long-run aggregate supply is actually inelastic. And what that means is, if there's an increase in aggregate demand, which is faster than the growth in long-run aggregate supply, it will always cause demand pull inflation. And therefore, we can draw this diagram to represent that. So I suppose the biggest criticism of this diagram is it doesn't really look at the capacity point at that moment in time, and therefore this isn't really one of my favourites. I personally wouldn't necessarily use it. The diagram that I would use, which I think is better with respect to the current situation and making it more realistic to, for example, what the case study might suggest, is the Keynesian viewpoint. Now, I prefer the Keynesian viewpoint, and the reason for that is because the Keynesian viewpoint suggests that demand pull inflation will only occur if there is no spare capacity in the economy. So what it suggests that actually, when we're looking at long-run aggregate supply, there could still be, in the long term, there could still be spare capacity, and the economy could still be operating below full capacity. So therefore, there's no guarantee that any increase in AD, even if it's faster, at a faster rate, will definitely cause demand pull inflation. And to kind of just show you this, I've gone for a point of AD1 to AD2. So we can see here AD1 to AD2. Now, the reason why I've put AD1 to AD2 here is because it shows that there has been no demand pull inflation, and the reason being is because of all that spare capacity that we've got here. So even though there's an increase in AD, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be demand pull inflation, because all it's doing is it's utilising the spare capacity at this moment in time. Now, the only point where maybe it might cause demand pull inflation is if whatever's caused the increase in aggregate demand has had quite a strong multiplier effect, and that is why I've drawn AD3 as well here, because this suggests that there's been quite a strong multiplier effect, and because of the multiplier effect, that has caused demand pull inflation. putting from price level here to price level 2. So within this diagram I've drawn, now depending on what the capacity is like at the moment, and you'd have to get clues from the case study. So the case study will give you an idea if there's lots of spare capacity or if there's very little spare capacity, and then you can highlight that on the diagram. So if it says that there's quite a lot of spare capacity, I would be drawing AD1 around here to kind of really emphasize all that capacity that's available. If one of your analytical points could be it depends upon, for example, but it depends on the rate of the multiplier effect, and again that might relate to the type of injection perhaps that's taken place and what the knock-on effect might be, then you could say, however, because of the multiplier effect, it might take it closer to full capacity and therefore might start putting pressure on the current capacity, causing demand pull inflation. So if, again, any more increases in AD, or if the multiplier effect is stronger than AD3, then we'll see, again, it going closer and closer to full capacity and increase in the price level. So the next one I'm going to consider is a different type of inflation, and this is cost push inflation, and this is when it relates mostly to the cost of factors of production perhaps going up, and therefore we look at a short-run aggregate supply shift, but we look at a short-run aggregate supply shift to the left. So we can see here SRS1 to SRS2, and the reason we know this is the case because we can see that as cost of production has increased, it's had a negative impact on national output, and it's caused price level to increase from PL1 to PL2. Now, what could cause this? Well, it could be negative supply shocks. It could be something along the lines of maybe suddenly there's been an increase in commodity prices, which, again, perhaps it wasn't expected, and it's caused that impact to the cost of resources and the cost of manufacturing and so on. So you can look at it from that point of view. But anything that causes the cost of production to go up and causing cost push inflation, we will see a left shift of short-run aggregate supply. Now, the next scenario we're going to look at is to do with economic decline. Now, I'm not going to draw the economic cycle. I wouldn't necessarily draw that unless it's asked of you. I'd look at maybe some other different diagrams that you could focus on. Now, one of the diagrams you could look at is a PPF. And what I've done, I've just labelled A as the point of economic decline, and the reason for that is, again, look at the excess capacity within the economy that it's not efficiently utilising. So we can see that there's maybe factors of production that are not being used. Maybe this suggests that there's high levels of unemployment, and it could suggest maybe there is negative growth and there is a recession taking place. Now, because it's inside of the PPF, that's what determines and that's what shows the examiner that you consider it from the viewpoint of they're not utilising, they're not using up the factors of production, and it shows negative growth or a decline in economic growth. So again, if we saw maybe an arrow inwards towards A, then we could see that it's not utilising it. Another one, and again, I would go for a long-term viewpoint in terms of what is the current capacity at the moment. Emphasise that there is spare capacity because of the economic decline, and we could use an AD1 towards an AD2, and we can see that national output is falling from Y1 to Y2, and that's causing the issues. So we can see because of the economic decline, all it's meaning is that capacity of the economy is not being utilised enough, and it's just showing excess capacity. So again, the economy is not working efficiently. This diagram should also be used when you're looking at different types of deflation. So, for example, malign deflation. Now, malign deflation occurs when prices fall because of a structural lack of demand. And what that does, it creates huge excess capacity in the economic system, as we can see from AD1 shifting to AD2. So again, if there's a slump in demand, companies are forced to kind of make labour redundant, for example, because they've not got enough demand. It might even cause a negative multiplier effect, and we could just see more and more excess capacity being shown. So in considering increases in long-term economic growth, I would be looking at, again, I always go for the Keynesian viewpoint just because I think it's so much more realistic when looking at capacity and looking at what can happen with price level and national output. But what I would be going for is a long-run aggregate supply shift to the right. Now, what can cause this? We can look at supply-side policies. We can look at maybe improvements in the mobility of labour. We can think about training and education of labour, enhancing their skill levels. We could look at infrastructure improvements and investment in R&D and technology, which is making processes much more efficient in operations. We can look at all these factors which might boost the current capacity of the economy and therefore determining long-term economic growth. And we can see what's so good about long-term economic growth is actually it can help achieve every macroeconomic objective. And the reason for that is we can see, well, first of all, with the increase of national output, that helps towards achieving high levels of economic growth, which is the whole point of this diagram. But in doing so, there's obviously that derived demand for labour, and we need more labour to produce the output, so therefore it's utilising more labour, and that helps with employment. Again, we can see that the price level has fallen from PL2 to PL1. Now, in terms of that could mean that we are more internationally competitive, because if we're thinking about other countries looking at our economy, maybe thinking about buying our goods, they'll see that, okay, number one, this country can meet the demand for the goods because they're productive, they're efficient, they can meet output, but also they can do it at a very efficient price level, which would be attractive for many countries and their customers. So again, that would increase the demand for our exports. So that would achieve the balance of payments, but also, as I've said before, the price level becomes more efficient, so therefore it stabilises, and therefore, again, another macroeconomic objective is achieved. This would also be a good diagram when looking, if we're thinking about price level, looking at benign deflation, and what this relates to falling prices are caused by higher productivity. So it goes hand in hand with robust growth. So if the falling prices are simply the result of improving technology or better managerial practices, then that's actually seen as quite positive. Now, there is also another diagram that we could use when looking at long-term economic growth. And it's this diagram, and we can see that there's been an increase, a shift from PPF1 to PPF2, just showing that the capacity has now grown. And once upon a time, we could produce up to PPF1, but now, because of improvements in long-term economic growth, we can now boost that to PPF2.